Hello, my name is Dr. Randy Kluver, and it's my privilege to serve as the Dean of the School of Global Studies and Partnerships at Oklahoma State University. As you are aware, relations between the U.S. and Iran are strained, with tensions increasing and decreasing almost on a daily basis. What is the current U.S. foreign policy on Iran, and what does this mean for the larger Persian Gulf region? How does it affect our diplomacy? Dr. Trita Parsi, the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, is an award-winning author and an expert on the geopolitics of the Middle East and U.S.-Iranian relations. He recently visited the OSU campus to speak for our Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies speaker series. I sat down with Trita to discuss the current state of U.S.-Iranian relations and his perspective on diplomatic engagement in the region. So Dr. Parsi, thank you for visiting Oklahoma State.
Thank you so much for having me.
I believe this is your second visit here.
It is.
And it's always a delight to have you. I hope
Likewise.
that you're enjoying the nice Oklahoma weather.
Yeah, the February summer.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a little bit of a background question. Tell us a little bit about the Quincy Institute. It's a relatively new organization and where it's positioned and what your goals are with the Institute.
So I, together with a couple other people, put together the Quincy Institute. We just launched late 2019. And it is a very different think tank in Washington because there's not a lot of think tanks in Washington who, first of all, are transpartisan in the sense that we're getting our support from both the left and the right, but also because we question some of the first principles of American foreign policy. We don't believe that it's just some of the methods of our foreign policy that need to be reassessed. We also want to question some of the main objectives. So, for instance, we strongly believe in American leadership, but we believe that U.S. foreign policy should be centered on diplomacy and military restraint, and that we have to separate American leadership from American military domination. We believe that it is essential to end these endless wars, and we believe that the reason why we have ended up in these endless wars is because the previous grand strategy, or the one that currently is in place, propagates that we have to dominate almost the entire globe militarily. We don't believe that you can dominate militarily all the time without being at war almost at every time, at some point, at somewhere.
If we go back in American history, prior to World War II, you saw a lot of impetus in the United States to refrain from not engage in foreign entanglements, and this goes back to our very founding. And so how do you avoid charges of being isolationist?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to recognize that we are not in any way, shape, or form advocating reducing diplomatic engagement. It's the military excesses that we think are highly problematic for the United States, that has weakened the U.S., but also made the world more unsafe. So this idea of not engaging the world, etc., is not something that we in any way, shape, or form would sign on to. But we want to question at the same time those who think that being involved in war all the time some way, somehow constitutes engagement. To us, that ends engagement. That is actually not the true engagement we should be having. So we find any such accusations of isolationism or trying to connect us to those movements in the past to be completely erroneous and completely missing the point of what we're saying. We're named the Quincy Institute because of John Quincy Adams and the speech he gave in 1821 in which he said, America should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And if it did so, yes, it could end up becoming the dictatuses of the world, but it would become so at the expense of its own liberty and its own spirit. And in our view, 199 years later, there's a lot of wisdom in what he said and a lot of things that we're seeing today that has come true, unfortunately, of his prediction, that we have ended up in these endless wars, and that has come at the expense of America's own spirit and its own liberty at home.
So when would be an appropriate time for American military engagement?
Well, first of all, there has to be an actual threat towards the United States itself. Right now, I think we have such an expansive definition of what is U.S. national interests, or that we are involved in too many things in which no one really can explain how is this really in the U.S.'s national interest to do so. We have treaty obligations, of course, and we're not advocating of just getting rid of them or walking out of deals in the manner that the current administration has. But some of them should be reviewed. And I think we should really question and reassess as to whether dominating certain regions militarily actually serves U.S. interests at this point. It may be so that during the Cold War, certain doctrines needed to be put in place because of the geopolitical context at that time. The geopolitical context has changed dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
Why shouldn't we reassess some of those doctrines accordingly? And these are things that right now I don't see a lot of voices in Washington raising and questioning. I see a lot of people outside of Washington raising questions about this kind. So the disconnect that we see between what the American public wants and what the DC, Washington foreign policy establishment pursuing has become wider and wider. And I think we are in some ways a correction to that because we're advocating something and arguing for something that most American tends to agree with.
That's terrific. But within DC, you have your own monster to slay, right?
Yeah.
Which is sort of the dominant consensus. In your comments earlier today, you juxtaposed American military presence in the Middle East with American diplomatic presence. And one of your arguments was that while we have pulled back diplomatically, we've not pulled back militarily. And your argument was that that relationship probably should be reversed. Can you talk a little bit about
Absolutely.
that?
I think there's been a lot of strong reactions, if not temper tantrums, over the idea of pulling out of Syria or pulling out of Afghanistan. But we're a little bit stunned to see that there's so little reaction to the fact that the U.S. constantly is pulling out diplomatically right now. Just take the example of when Trump first said that he wants to leave Syria about a year and a half ago. There were a lot of anger, a lot of people were very upset. You had Jim Mattis resign. But there was almost no reaction when Trump completely abandoned the Geneva process about a year earlier. That was a diplomatic process that had been put into place to find a solution to the Syrian civil war. The U.S. just abandoned that track. Later on, the Europeans did as well as a result of the U.S. not being it. And it transformed into what is today called the Astana process, which is led by Russia, Turkey, and Iran and the Syrian government. This is a complete abdication of diplomatic responsibility, complete abandonment, but most Americans have no clue about it because no one resigned over it. No TV anchor threw a temper tantrum on TV over it. But the idea of pulling out the military was seen as the end of American involvement in the Middle East. Reality is we haven't pulled out militarily. Trump has actually put more troops in the Middle East than was there when he first got in. Just in the last couple of months, he's added several thousand more. But we have abandoned diplomatically, and that's what we should be worried about. And this goes back to your earlier question. We're stunned that some would make the accusation of isolationism, whereas in reality, we're the ones arguing in favor of engagement. We just don't believe that military engagement should be the number one piece on the menu.
Sure. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Iran because as we were talking a little bit earlier, it's often the case in the United States particularly where we have a very monolithic view of a government, of a nation, where we really often have very little experience of it. As you noted earlier today, the U.S. policy has been extreme pressure on Iran. It's caused economic devastation and hollowing out. What does the United States have to fear from Iran? Militarily, diplomatically, and so on and so forth. Is the government stable? Is it strong? Are the Iranian people themselves strongly anti-American?
I've seen no evidence that the Iranian people themselves are strongly anti-American in the sense of really disliking the United States. Heavily critical of U.S. foreign policy, yes, but that you'll find anywhere. So I don't think, fortunately, at this point, we have an enmity that is people to people. I do fear that if this escalates towards a military confrontation, then perhaps that type of a deeper enmity will emerge. Fortunately, at this point, it does not appear to exist. But Iran has been a challenger of American hegemony in the Middle East for the last 40 years. And in that sense, it is a challenge. It is a threat to some of its neighbors, just as much as they also pose a threat to Iran. And there is a very strong need for being able to engage diplomatically to be able to resolve some of these issues, particularly if the Iranians were to go on a path that could lead them to a nuclear weapon. And this is what the previous administration did. They engaged diplomatically, and that issue, by and large, was resolved until the later administration decided to pull out of that agreement. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a very valuable question that you ask yourself because I do suspect that if the United States did not seek to sustain or reestablish military hegemony in the Middle East, a very critical, not all-encompassing, but a very critical element that has been a driving force of that enmity actually would be neutralized. Because reality is the United States and Iran have been in the same space. And one of the things that is happening in the United States is that more and more people are starting to raise the question mark as to whether the U.S.'s military presence in the Middle East is that beneficial to the U.S. any longer, mindful of the fact that the region is not as strategically important as it was before. Now, that may create a lot of problems for some of the allies of the United States. The Saudis, Emiratis, and others are clearly concerned about that. But I think it's important to recognize the U.S. does not have a treaty obligation with any of those states. That doesn't mean, in our view, that there should be just an abandonment in any way, shape, or form. But it does mean that we have an opportunity to perhaps help the region negotiate its own security architecture that can then stand on its own legs. And this is important because so often the security architectures that are put in place can only stand if the U.S. provides the legs, meaning the U.S. is really underwriting the cost of it. I think we have to move away from that model because this is becoming way too costly for the United States, particularly when the benefits are dwindling.
Sure. I'd like to talk a little bit about Iran and its neighbors. When we look at the Middle East, to use a terribly poor analogy, it's a three-legged stool between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, or at least three contentious powers that attitudes often revolve around. This was complicated a couple of years ago with the Saudi-led boycott of Qatar. And your argument earlier today, you argued that were the U.S. to pull some troops out and to disengage militarily, some of the sentiment currently directed against the U.S. would probably be directed more towards Iran. I think the big fear in the United States is that were we to pull out, Iran would just be able to steamroll that region. But when you think about these other powers, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Emiratis, and so on and so forth, what do you think would play out? How can we imagine a less contentious Middle East?
So what I was mentioning was in the context of what would happen in Iraq if the U.S. were to leave. I think a lot of the Iraqi nationalism eventually would target Iran and Iran's oversized influence in that country. But I think, going back to your earlier question, I don't believe that Iran has the ability to steamroll the other countries. Iran's ability to project power, certainly militarily, is actually very, very limited. What Iran has been adept at is to take advantage of American mistakes. The United States has the ability to go in, occupy countries, but then it doesn't have the ability to do much more beyond that. And that's where the Iranians have stepped in and managed to take advantage of it. If the U.S. doesn't do those things, Iran has far less ability to be able to penetrate many of those countries. But ultimately, I think we have to come back to a fundamental structural reality that exists. This is a region without a security architecture. It is a region without any clear pecking order. It is an orderless region at this point. Unless that macro infrastructure is put in place, we're not going to be able to really do much to be able to make the region safer. And it's also going to be very futile to go and point to any specific actor, whether it's Iran or Saudi or Israel, as being the source of instability. This is actually where something American leadership could be very, very helpful, but not if it is viewing itself as a party to the conflict, but much more so if it sees itself as a party to the solution. Right now, we're tied down in so many different agreements and loyalties. Some of them are not treaty obligations, but because of political reasons, etc. And as a result, we're oftentimes part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I think a foreign policy that is built on restraint would actually pull us out of that, but then strengthen our ability to mediate and help bring about much more sustainable solutions for stability.
Terrific. Well, the final question I'd like to ask you is at a university, we take great pride in the fact that we're able to help students orient themselves towards the future. And of course, we play the same role in our communities, helping to prepare workforces for the future and so on and so forth. In your view, what are the big let me make it a two-part question. Number one, what should our students be preparing for in the future? What are the big trends, the big global trends that you think they should be preparing for? And number two, what do you think is the long-term future for the region, for the Middle Eastern region?
If I take on the first question, and I like the fact that you phrased it as what are the trends, I'm going to rephrase it in the more negative way of saying what are the threats. And I think what students today should be really, really focused on is that we are facing a planetary existential threat with climate change. Now, whether people believe it's man-made or not, I'm going to set that aside. Bottom line is there are changes taking place. And in order to be able to have a fighting chance to be able to address that, reverse that, we're going to need a level of human collaboration that never has happened in human history. What kind of foreign policy do we need to have in order to make that degree of human collaboration possible? That is not what we've been thinking about. We have not been thinking about the collective good of the planet. That's not how states have been designed to think. They've been designed to think about their national interest, national security above all else. And that may very well have been the right way of thinking about it in previous eras. In the current era that we're in the era that the future students will be in, it's not going to be a successful strategy of thinking of a national interest above the threat that exists towards the entire planet. And I think that is going to require a far more collaborative, partnership-oriented foreign policy than we have seen in the previous decades. It's going to require a significant rethink of how we do things. And far too little about that has been done so far. Far too little thinking of that has been done. And I think it's going to be absolutely existential.
Very good. Well, thank you for your visit to Oklahoma State University.
Thank you.
We welcome you anytime, and thank you for your comments.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
It was our pleasure to host Trita Parsi to OSU for our Iranian and Persian Gulf Speakers Series. You can watch his full IPGS talk as well as others on O State TV. For information on the School of Global Studies and Partnerships or the Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies program, visit global.okstate.edu.